Hello everybody. In this video we're going to take a look at two different interesting techniques for making particles, nParticles, emit other nParticles. So for this example, the first thing we'll do is go to the nParticles, create options, and I'm going to have my default particle type set to balls right now. And we'll go to the emitter and create a new emitter. I'm simply resetting the settings just so it'll create the default omni emitter. We'll go ahead and make changes to that in just a moment. So if I play my scene here, then this is what I have. I have an omni emitter emitting 100 particles per second. Okay, so we'll make a few changes. I'm going to take my emitter and just move it up a little bit on the y-axis. And we'll set the emitter to only emit 1 particle per second. I'm going to change my emitter to directional. And let's go ahead and play it and see what we have. So currently we have our emitter emitting a single particle every second, and it's emitting it on the direction X, as indicated with this red arrow. So it's the emitter, which is placed here, is emitting them in this direction. Gravity is taking over, however, and then they start to fall. If we were to increase the speed from 1 to, let's say, 12, then these particles will come out with more force. In addition, if we add some direction on the y, 1 for instance, then not only will they be emitted on the x, but also on the y, so we'll get something more like a 45-degree angle here as it comes out, and then gravity will take over it. And if I add spread to it, which is found here, then we can make it so that it actually comes out in more like a cone type format, so that we get it going in many different directions. Unlike the omni emitter, however, it's not emitting particles downward. So now that we've created that, let's create a polygon plane, which we will use for collision. So I made my polygon plane here, and then I will go to the nCloth passive collider, create passive collider, and now rewinding and then playing, my particles get emitted and they collide with this ground plane that I've created. While we're at it, I'm going to go ahead and add more frames to my timeline. I'm going to set mine to 500. Remember to make sure when you're working with these particles that you have your playback speed set to play every frame. Remember, that's very important when you're working with nParticles or nHair or any of these kind of dynamics systems. And then I also like to have it set to max playback speed to my frame rate, which in this case is 24 frames per second. So in other words, it's going to play every frame so it can do all the calculations it needs to do. It's going to try to play it at the proper speed of 24 frames a second, but if it needs to slow down to make the calculations, it'll slow down in my working view here in Maya. Now, this next step is not necessary. However, when you start dealing with more particles in your scene, it might be helpful. Notice that my particle that I've created is called nParticle 1. I'm going to go ahead and rename that. I'm going to call it something a little more descriptive. I'll call it projectile. nParticle 1. So now we have our emitter, our particle, our nucleus node. We have a surface for these particles to collide with. Let's go to the next step. So what I'm going to do is select my particle that I've created, the particle that's getting emitted by the emitter, and I'm going to go to nParticles, Particle Collision Event Editor. What does this particle collision event editor do? Well, it allows you to have events be triggered when your particle collides with something. So when your particle collides with a surface or with another particle, you can create an event, which is what we're going to do. We're going to create an event where the particle will get emitted, it will shoot out, it'll fall down, hit the surface, and then when it hits the surface, colliding, it will trigger off this event. So notice that in my event editor, we've got two columns here, objects and events. Currently, I have my projectile underscore nParticle selected here under the objects. And what I'm going to do is create an event for it. Now we've got a couple different kinds of events that we can do. We've got an emit or split. They're both very similar. We're going to go ahead and try emit. When I click on emit, you can see that I can set a number of different parameters. For instance, how many particles. There's also a spread and an inherent velocity property here. Let's go ahead and click on the Create Event button. And now you'll notice that there is an event here in the event column. And on top of that, it's created a new particle, which we can see in our outliner here. So let's see what's happening here in our scene if we play it. And as you can see, when the particle collides with the ground, it emits other particles. Now we have it currently set to emit one particle. However, we're getting lots of additional particles here. Let's see what's going on with that. I think the first thing I'll do here to try to resolve that is change this property here. Currently, it says on which collision do you want the event to happen, and we have it checked as all collisions, meaning that each time the particle collides, it's going to trigger this event. And these collisions can be with this ground surface here. It can also be with collision with other particles. So we're going to uncheck all collisions, and I'm going to set collision number to 1. Meaning that on the first collision, in other words, when it comes down and hits the ground plane, it's going to trigger off this event and emit the particles, emit these new particles. Okay, let's go ahead and rewind and play. And you can see that that's what it's doing. It's emitting a single particle when it collides with the ground plane. I'm going to close the particle collision editor for now. We can go back and open it up again later. But let's work on that second particle system that we now have here. And in fact, I think the first thing I'll do is go ahead and rename that one as well. And we'll call this one burst nParticle 1. We can also change this particle, just as you can with other particles that we've looked at in previous videos, by going to the attribute editor with your particle selected. And in this case, let's go ahead and change the appearance of it by going to shading, and instead of blobby surface, so that it looks different than the first particle, we will go ahead and change it to, how about multi-streak? We'll try that. And let's go ahead and play it and see what we have. little bit hard to see, but you'll notice if you look very carefully that when these particles get emitted, they are emitting out a second particle, which is a multi-streak particle. I'm going to return to nParticles Particle Collision Event Editor, open that up, and we'll find our event here. I had to select under the objects the proper particle here that has the event associated with it. And we're going to change the number of particles emitted. Currently it's set to only 1. We're going to set it to 100. And I think this will make it more visible what's happening. So let's go ahead and play. And as you can see, it emits particles when it collides with the ground plane. One other thing that we should do here is that currently the original particle is not dying off. Now we haven't set a lifespan to it, and we don't actually need to for this particular example. What I'm going to do is click on this checkbox here, original particle dies. And if we select that, then what that means is that when this event is triggered, the original particle is just going to disappear. We won't need it anymore at that point anyway, so it'll just disappear, and all we'll see is this second particle that will be emitted by the event. So let's go ahead and play this and check it out. And that's what we've got so far. So for the time being, I think we're done with this particle collision event editor. I will show you one more thing before we close it and move on to some other techniques. Remember that we set it to collision number 1, meaning that the first collision is what will trigger off this event. Let's see what happens if we change that number to 2. This means then that the projectile particle should bounce once, and then on the second bounce it'll emit the particles. Let's see if that's in fact what happens. And in fact it is. You can see that the original particle is bouncing twice before it dies off and triggers these other particles. I'm going to set this back to 1. And we'll go ahead and start working on the particle system, the burst particle, start playing around a little bit with its properties. So I'm going to go ahead and close this collision editor now. So let's take a look at what we have here. I'll play it one more time. We'll see that these particles get emitted and then they create this burst effect with the second particle system here. I'm going to do a couple things with this particle system. I'm going to select my burst particle system and go to the attribute editor. And of course we can do a lot of different things with it. We can adjust the tail on this multi-streak if we want to make it wider or narrower. We can adjust the fade on it if we need to, the tail size as well. We can do lots of different things to adjust the visuals of this. But also, I think what I want to do is give it a lifespan. Currently, it's set to live forever. This means then that the particles will continue to be calculated even when we're not seeing them, and it'd be better to kill them off when we don't need them any longer. So I'm going to go to lifespan and change live forever, and we can either make it constant or random range. I'll go ahead and make it a random range. Let's try a lifespan of 2 with about half a second of randomness applied to it, and play that and see how that looks. As you can see, it doesn't really change the look of it, but it does make it more efficient because it's killing off those particles. In addition to the burst particles lifespan, let's see if we can maybe dial back this, this burst effect, make it a little bit less extreme. So I think to try that, what I'm going to do is come over here to the dynamic properties in its attribute editor here. And I'm going to adjust some of these properties here. Perhaps we'll try the dampening or the damp property first and see if we can dial back this a little bit. So I'm going to simply scrub the slider over. We can try about halfway to about 5 and rewind and play and see what we get. As you can see, that looks like we've dialed it back a little too much. Maybe try half that value at around 2.5 or so. Still too much. I'm going to really bring this number down considerably. We'll keep a very small value, but we will have a value on here. Perhaps we can try 0.2. And I think I like that. That works for me. Now, of course, we can change other visuals with our particle here. We can come in here and adjust the color, for example. Right now it's set to randomized ID, but we could change that to normalized age if we wanted and adjust its colors here. Let's look at one more way that we can make our particles emit other particles. This next technique will be different than using the collision editor because we won't be using collisions to trigger these events. So what I'm going to do is select my projectile particle, and I'm going to go to nParticles. We'll take a look at the create options. I'm going to set it to cloud this time. And I'll go to emit from object. Now, understand that right now the object I have selected is my first particle, the projectile particle. So we'll go ahead and say emit from object. And let's go ahead and play our scene and see what we have. And what you'll notice is that it's kind of broken things here for us. So the problem that we're having here is that the particles are colliding with each other. And this is causing it so that the projectile particle system doesn't ever make it far enough to be able to fall back to the ground and then trigger this event. It's triggering the event too early for creating the burst. So let's take a look at a very simple way that we can fix that. You'll remember, as we've looked at these particles, that we're typically working with 3 different things here. We've got our emitters, which emit the particles. We've got our nucleus node, which is the environmental conditions. And of course, we've got the particles themselves. So currently, we've got one nucleus node in our scene, meaning that all three of our particle systems are using that same nucleus node. And that's what allows them to interact with one another. That's one of the powerful things about the nParticle systems. But we can also create additional nucleus nodes, which then would make it so that the particle systems don't interact with one another. And that's what we're going to try this time. Let's go ahead and take this particle here that we just created. That's the smoke. That's going to be the smoke that gets emitted from our projectile particle. I'm going to go ahead and go to my channel box and rename it. We'll go ahead and call it smoke. Since we named our other particles, we might as well name this one as well. And with it selected, what I'm going to do is go to Fields Solvers, Assign Solver, and we're going to assign a new solver. This will create a new nucleus node, a second nucleus node. And if I do that, you'll notice now we have two nucleus nodes. We've got nucleus 1 and nucleus 2. And if I play this, we now start to get our smoke that gets emitted from the projectile. Now that we have our smoke, I'll go ahead and adjust some of its properties. Go ahead and play a little bit of this, and we'll take a look at what it looks like here by stopping it on frame 52 in this case. We'll select the nParticle itself, the smoke particle that we just created, go to the attribute editor, and do a couple things to it. First of all, let's not have the smoke live forever. Let's go ahead and give it a random range of perhaps 2 seconds with maybe half a second of randomness thrown in there. Play that, see how that looks. So now you can see that the smoke starts to die off. We can adjust the size of our smoke by changing the radius of the particle itself. And we can change that size over time by changing the radius scale, by mapping it to the normalized age, and then making it get emitted at a smaller size and having it get larger over time. If we want, we can smoothen out this. Linear would probably work just fine, but we could smooth this out like so. I think I'm actually going to keep it linear. So now these will get bigger over time. The smoke gets bigger over time. If we want, we could add some randomization to that as well, however. And we can go to the shading to change the look of our smoke. So perhaps I will have it become transparent over time. So I'll go to the opacity scale, map that to normalized age, and we'll simply bring down the opacity towards the end of this scale here. We can change the color, perhaps mapping that also to the normalized age and give it more of a smoky color rather than this blue here. Maybe we'll try black. And we'll take that first white and maybe just give it more of a gray. We can add a little gray blue to it, why not? Perhaps add a little bit of randomization in that as well. And let's play this and see what it's looking like. I'm going to turn off the grid so we can see this a little bit better. And that's what we've got so far. So before wrapping up this video, we'll go ahead and try out one more thing that could be fun, and that is to swap out the projectile particle for an object, a polygon mesh, for example. So for this, I'm going to go ahead and create a polygon sphere, and we'll just do a couple quick modeling changes to it to give it maybe a little bit of a more interesting form. I'm going to go to my modeling menu set, to the mesh tools, sculpting tools, and I'll work with some of the sculpting tools here. I think I'll try the flatten tool. And we'll simply flatten out and give this a more boulder-like appearance. Nothing too complicated here. And I think that should work. And we'll also create a new material for it. So I'll go to my hypershade, make a new material. We'll make a Lambert. Perhaps I'll name this Lambert. And we'll give it, let's go ahead and apply it. We'll apply it to our boulder. And I'm going to make the boulder a very dark color here. Maybe add a little bit of suggestion of color to it, but we'll have it be quite dark, something like that. And then under the incandescence, we'll apply a ramp. Change the colors of our ramp. And the noise frequency. I pressed 6 on my keyboard. I wasn't seeing my material applied to it because I hadn't pressed 6 on my keyboard yet. But now that we can actually see the material on there, we can play around with its various values. Its V wave, for instance, noise, and the noise frequency. And for this example, perhaps that will suffice. Before I forget, I think I'll rename this object here. Call it boulder mesh, and maybe delete the history on it. And now we'll apply this object so that this will replace the projectile particle. So let's see, the first thing we'll do is we'll select the particle and apply an instancer to it by going to the Effects, nParticles, Instancer. Now I'll select my mesh, select the instancer, open up the attribute editor, and we'll add the selected to the list here. And if we play our scene here, you'll see that the particle has been replaced with the mesh. I'm going to go ahead and scale down my original mesh. and perhaps I'll hide it as well. So there you have it. There's a couple ways that you can emit additional particles with your particle systems. We looked at two different ways that we could do that, having the particle system be an emitter itself, as well as using the particle collision event editor, which creates an event upon collision of the particle, which then emits other particles. In addition, we also looked at how we could swap out a mesh for the particle that's being emitted. So hopefully this video has been helpful for you, and thank you for watching.